Hi, everyone. Welcome to the cultural geography section of this course. I'm going to have several shorter videos as we go along in terms of introducing cultural geography and how we approach that. So this one right now is going to be much more about geographic basics. And then later we'll go into population, migration, and cultural traits. These are things that we're going to be covering throughout the course for each world region. So this is just an introduction to those topics. So let me go ahead and share my screen. So again, here's kind of the topics for this week. We have geographic concepts, very basic ones, population geography, which is really important, migration, cultural traits, and international development, which is one of my areas of expertise. So first thing is location. Where are places located? And as geographers, that's really important thing for us. And we have different ways of doing it. There's toponyms, which is where people, the names of places like San Luis Obispo or San Francisco or Santa Fe, and they actually talk about the history of the place, right? So what does San Luis Obispo mean to you in terms of the name? It's Spanish. It's related to religion, and that's that location. There's other places, for example, like, No Name Colorado. They forgot to name it. And so it's just called No Name Colorado. But other ways for location is mathematical. So as you can see here, latitude, longitude. So lines of latitude are parallels, starts at the equator. They're based on angles from the center of the earth. And you start with 0 angle at the equator and 90 degrees at the north and south pole, whether it's north or south. In the middle, it'd be 45 degrees. So they're equidistant, and that's very easy to do. Longitude are these lines that run north and south, but they measure distance east and west of the prime meridian, which goes through Greenwich, England. And basically, the world got together and said, let's standardize this. And so Greenwich, England became kind of the centroid for that, for the prime meridian. Now, these are more difficult because they're not equidistant between each other. They converge at the poles and they're wider at the equator. But we can use, latitude, longitude to find our location on the Earth. Another one is that we, as geographers, we like to break the world up into different regions. All right, so defining what we're talking about. A formal region has formal boundaries. So if we're in a classroom, if you're in the class, you're in the class. If you're outside the class, you're not in the class. So it's either or. So here's like the state of Iowa. If you cross into the boundaries there, the formal boundary, you're in Iowa. If you move north, you go to Minnesota, you're not in Iowa. So formal regions are very kind of specific. But the world doesn't really work like that. So that's what a functional region is, meaning that you have a centroid where things are, much more alike. And as you move further away, there's a distance decay. And that's something we talked about the first rule of geography, where the things that are closer together are much more alike than things that are further apart. This map right here is talking about people watching certain television, like the news, right? So you have local news things. And as you move away, it starts to decay until you watch the news from another place. A good example of this would be like if you were going to, you're here in San Luis Obispo, but you want to travel internationally. You want to go on an airplane ride. So, how many of you would go to SFO, San Francisco? How many would go to LAX? We're right on the border of a functional region between those two. We're equidistant. Now, if you're from LA, from the south, the southern part of California, you probably go to LAX. If you're in the north, you might probably go to SFO. But if you lived in Monterey, you're probably going to SFO. If you're in Santa Barbara, you're probably going to LAX. And so that's this kind of boundary, right? As you move across, there's a distance decay and where you're going to go. And we're right in the middle of two functional regions. Then my favorite region, and yes, I do have a favorite region, is vernacular regions. Vernacular talks about how people speak. And you can map out how people speak, but it's actually progressed to the point that basically a vernacular region means what is in your mind. So if I made you map out San Luis Obispo, everybody would have a different map. You'd have different things that you highlight. And they're not wrong. They're all correct. It's your own perspective of a place. And so I like vernacular regions for that perspective. Here's an example. What are terms for carbonated non-alcoholic beverages? Do you say pop, soda, Coca-Cola? What do you say when you want to ask for one of these types of beverages? And here's a map where they mapped it out, and there's a regional difference. And that's really tied to the vernacular. So in the bluish areas, we're looking at people that say, we like pop. So if you go there and you want to have a beverage, like a Coca-Cola, whatever it is, you would say, I want a pop. In California, we're very much a soda speaking place. So people here say, I'm going to get a soda. So we can see that here in California and Arizona, the Northeast. And then for some reason, we have this whole blob here by St. Louis, Missouri, and maybe Milwaukee, where they call it soda. And then other people might say we would like a Coca-Cola. And that's the red areas. And that's really concentrated on the South. So basically, and I actually do this myself, when I'm looking for a soda, I'll say, or whatever it is, I'll say, yeah, I'll take a Coke. What type of Coke? 7, I'll take a Dr. Pibbs or whatever it is. And so and that's basically because Coca-Cola is centered in Georgia. And that has spread through the South, but that's the common way that people talk about their soda. So we can look at different regions based on that, right? Even just vernaculars. If you look at England, they have different dialects. We have that here in the US as well, if you've talked to people from different parts of the country. Now, in terms of global regions, this is in the eye of the beholder. I would make it different myself, but this is from one of our textbooks. And we see North America, Latin America, and the Caribbean, all of these different areas. And then we define those depending on your own viewpoint. Now, a second thing, instead of location and regions, we also talk about association. Spatial association is very important in geography. Are there correlations between phenomenon? It could be ethnicity, race, climate, all those different aspects. And are there correlations? And we can actually measure those and quantify the relationships between different types of phenomenon, whether it's how you speak, or how you live, the agriculture, etc. So I'm going to give an example right now. This is global climates. The green is tropical, generally wet. We talked about that with physical geography. Then we have dry climates, like the Sahara Desert down here in South Africa, etc., and much of Australia. And then mid-latitude ones, etc. So we can see kind of a pattern of these different climates. And then look at population. So what do we see with population? We'll talk more about this coming up, but we see high concentrations in certain places like East Asia, South Asia, parts of Africa as well. And we can look at that. Does that relate to climate? And then that also helps understand the different types of agriculture. This is a very complex map. We'll be talking about it for each world region that we talk about. But you can see that in the very dry ones, you have a different type of agriculture, which is mostly pastoral nomads. Places with high population, we have intensive agriculture because they have to feed large populations. And it's a very complex map, so don't worry about it now, but I'm just going to kind of come through here and just see, here is, again, the climates, population, and agricultural practices. And they're all related to each other. So we've tried to correlate those things. Now, another part of spatial aspects is diffusion. And this is interaction between places. Now, diffusion is basically something starts somewhere and then it diffuses elsewhere. And a great example is the internet. You guys think it's, normal. Everyone has internet, but actually 50% of the world does not have, actually, I think it's 60% does not have access to the internet. So it's not something that's ubiquitous. So here you can see in 1995, places like Finland and Iceland had higher amounts of people that had access to the internet, but it was pretty, not too much. And I was there at that time period, and I remember being I could actually surf the entire internet at that time because there's not that many spaces. Here's 2000. Now we see exploding in North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, but much of the world still left behind in 2000. And here's 2014, where it spread much more widely. So access to the internet is much more available around the world. But at the same time, again, about 60% of the world's population, even today in 2023, do not have access to the internet. But it is something that diffused. Another thing about spatial interaction is that we have to have connections. All right. So the first thing is networks. For example, I'm not going to interact with somebody, 100 miles away if there's no road to them. But now we have that. And this is airline networks showing how we have these hubs, and that allows us to interact with other people. And the internet's kind of the greatest example of that. But again, distance decay, the further you are away from the nodes, it's harder to actually access and interact with people across space. So San Luis Obispo, we're pretty limited in terms of our interactions. We have to go to LA or San Francisco, and then we can only fly to like Salt Lake City and Phoenix and Denver. We have very limited access. So our interaction is much less. But if you live in places like Houston or on this one, New York or Philadelphia, you have much more access to different places, and that allows it. And the internet, again, is probably the best example of this, where we can interact across the globe. But distance decay still works. Now that brings up the idea in our modern world of globalization about an aspect called space-time compression. That means that people have talked about the world's becoming flatter, that we're becoming more alike. We can interact more quickly than we've done in the past. So this is kind of an interesting map here. It shows Christopher Columbus took 37 days to sail from Spain to the Caribbean. Later, because of increased technology, the Titanic would take 60 hours. That's a really bad example because it didn't make it, but it would have taken 60 hours. Then we have Lindbergh flying across from Europe to the Americas in 33 and a half hours in 1927. And then we can think about astronaut Glenn. In 1962, he did 3 orbits of the world in 5 hours. So that's space-time compression, the idea that the area that the space that we can interact with and the time it takes has been shrinking. Now, in this course, of course, globalization is a main theme. It's called global geography. And some people say the world's getting smaller, right? So we can interact more across space in less time, and the idea with the world getting smaller means that we become more alike. People adopt things like the English language or other things. But I argue the different aspect, that the world's getting bigger. It means that the area that we can interact and talk and do things together is getting bigger. I think about my grandma growing up in British Columbia in Canada and then moving to North Dakota. Her world was really small. She did not know what was happening in the Middle East or in Europe. And it took so much time for them to actually learn about things. For me, it's instantaneous. I know what's happening in those places. And so my world is much bigger than my grandma's world was. And so that's what I like to argue here in terms of geography, that it's becoming more important as opposed to making a flat Earth, as some people say. Now, that creates tensions between the globalization of cultures and things and local ones. So, local cultures oftentimes end up disappearing, like language, as people adopt other types of languages, like English, for example. And I have a few things up here on the screen. One, this is a McDonald's on the top right. That's a McDonald's in France. They got upset that McDonald's had spread there and they were not using local things. So local farmers got together and they destroyed McDonald's restaurants in protest. And down here on the bottom left, this is the World Trade Organization. That's an organization that tries to promote global trade. All right. And there was different groups that got together to combat that. And so you had environmentalists, labor unions, indigenous populations, etc., saying that our voices are left out with this globalization. And it ended up in Seattle in 1999. Most of you guys probably weren't born by that time. But they had a meeting, and all these groups got together using the internet, actually, which is a global, a global thing, to get together and get together, and then they basically started some, well, basically riots once the yeah. And so they were protesting this whole idea of globalization and how it doesn't address the local issues that people have. So that's something that we can talk about throughout the course. All right, so that's my kind of quick introduction to this. We're going to move into population geography in the next section. We'll see you then.